Hello, everyone. I wanted to thank the DCASE organizing committee, particularly Nabor, for this opportunity to share with you some of the ongoing research in my lab. Today, I will be talking about active listening in everyday soundscapes and particularly delving into the role of attentional feedback. And this work will touch on studies by a number of people, but I will particularly highlight research from current and former students in the lab, Ashwin, Nick, Merve, and Sandeep. So when we talk about everyday soundscapes, I'm really referring to how we experience our acoustic environment in everyday life and the cacophony of sound sources that we experience as we navigate our world, walking from a quiet office to a very busy street. So our ability to make sense of this deluge of information and change in acoustics really engages a number of processes in our brain beyond just acoustic processing and our auditory system. So we know that attention is critical to make sense of our auditory surrounds, meaning our ability to focus on one sound source and ignore the other. And it is in fact attention that allows us to direct our searchlight, if you will, to one sound or another based on what we judge as the most important information at that moment in time. You know, if we're crossing the street, we may need to be more alert to the sounds of passing cars or car horns, while such sounds would be merely a distraction if we're standing on the sidewalk just having a conversation with someone. So we do know that attention is in fact very critical to our ability to make sense of our complex acoustic environment, and there are many examples of catastrophic failures of attention that resulted in really disastrous accidents. This is an example from an aviation accident of a commercial flight, United Flight 173, where in this case, the pilot was focusing his attention on a landing gear malfunction that he failed to take note of an alert of low fuel, resulting in this catastrophic accident. So this is but one of many examples, both in real life and in lab experiments, that highlight that listening is really an active process and encompasses much more than just our ability to hear a sound. And this is sort of an interesting quote from a book by Stephen Handel that highlights that listening is really an active process. So the quote says that listening is not the same as hearing. And listening is an active process in which our experience, our goals, our expectations really constrain and control our percepts in complex ways. And what is interesting here is that the complexity of this interaction between our sensory system, the part of our brain that processes the acoustic signal, and our cognitive system is often underappreciated due to the natural and intuitive nature by which we experience sounds around us. So this folk expression that hearing is through our ears and listening is through the mind also highlights this distinction between how a signal is heard or picked up by through our sensors, our ears, and how it is processed through the rest of our brain. So now if we take a look at a diagram of the auditory system, we know that sounds that enter our ears undergo a number of transformations as they are mapped from an acoustic signal to a sound percept. And while there is a great deal of cross projections between the different nuclei along the auditory system, we can still theoretically abstract these transformation into a sort of hierarchical system. And if we take an analogy from, say, neural networks, this hierarchical system is in fact a series of transformations where, say, an observation X is mapped into gradually complex embedding spaces Z through this mapping function phi. So this basically gives us a mapping function Q phi of Z given X that is indexed by the parameters phi for a corresponding level of this hierarchy I. So now if we dig into individual filters or neurons that make up each of these transformation levels, particularly in core auditory cortex, we can estimate the mapping parameters, sort of, or a neural transfer function that explain the transformation from the observation to the output at that particular neuron. So given that we're interested in auditory processing, these neural mapping functions basically give us or describe for us a range of time and frequency characteristics that each neuron is specifically tuned to. So decades of neuroscience research have basically shown that cortical spectrotemporal neural transfer functions, what we call STRF, spectrotemporal response functions or receptive fields, come in many shapes and sizes. So this is an example of a recording of such STRF from a single neuron in primary auditory cortex of an awake mammal. So this function basically gives us the filter characteristics or the preference spectral and temporal patterns that this neuron likes to respond to. So in this example, we see a transfer function, as I said, of a single neuron or an individual filter. The x-axis here represents time in milliseconds. The y-axis is frequency in kilohertz. Red regions here correspond to excitatory areas or patterns that this neuron likes to respond to, while blue here represents inhibitory areas or patterns that shut down the response from this neuron, while green all around here is sort of a baseline response. So looking at this particular example, we know that this filter preferentially responds to fairly narrow band signals around about 1 kilohertz. Looking at other examples, so these are 5 other examples, so a total of 6 individual neurons. We see sort of a great deal of variety. This is a neuron that is fairly broadly tuned or responds to broadband signals. These others are fairly narrowly tuned. Some of them are preferentially responding to spectrotemporal patterns, like you see here, sort of an FM-like sweep. This one is slightly tilted in the opposite direction. So altogether, we see this sort of tiling of the modulation space with a great deal of variety where each neuron is sort of selective to a particular pattern in spectrotemporal space. So taken together, what we have learned through numerous studies in many species is that one way to interpret the mapping of sound across sort of coherence and superior regions of temporal auditory cortex is that the signal undergoes a multi-resolution analysis. And so effectively a sound that comes in gets mapped through an array of millions of these neurons, resulting in a sort of distributed and detailed mapping of the modulation in the signal. So looking at the cortical activation through an fMRI study this time, this is a study that was done in humans, we know that there is a broad, so this is showing us the broad selectivity, not only to the frequency, which is shown in this panel here, but also to spectral modulations, shown here, as well as temporal modulations going from below 4 hertz all the way to greater than 16 hertz. So again, what this study, in addition to all these other studies in individual neurons, are showing us that there is a multi-resolution analysis that seems to be taking place in main regions in temporal cortex, which facilitates the process of parsing complex natural sounds. So now with this idea in mind of the series of transformation of the signal along the auditory hierarchy, we want to ask the question, well, how does attentional feedback modulate this information processing? We know there's a great deal of projections between auditory regions and frontal and parietal regions. And the question really is, what is the role of this attentional feedback that we know is so critical in facilitating parsing everyday complex sounds? So we know in some studies almost 20 years ago that were done in individual neurons that attention modulates these neural tuning characteristics on the fly as an animal is engaged in a task. And so these are studies that were performed by training animals to pay attention to specific sound targets and recorded from individual neurons in auditory cortex while the animal was paying attention to these target sounds, which allows us to get a peek into what happens to the mapping functions during attention. So this is a first example of some of these results. So in this, sort of what this panel is showing us is an initial passive STRF. Again, time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis, and we see that this is a neuron that is fairly narrowly tuned around 10 kilohertz. So this is a neuron that was recorded while the animal was in a passive state. It was just sitting, not particularly engaged with any task. Then the animal switches into an attentional task where it has to pay attention to a pure tone, in this case shown here with this red arrow around 7 kilohertz. And what you notice that all of a sudden, this one neuron is switching its sort of tuning characteristics and broadening it to encompass this region where this target of interest happens to be. So in another task, this is another spectral task, but in this time the animal was trained to pay attention or discriminate between two tones, one shown here in the red, one shown in blue. So again, in these studies, we recorded from the animals the sort of tuning characteristics for an individual neuron when the animal was in a passive state. And when you note is when the animal now engages in an attentional state, in this discrimination case, you see sort of spectral changes to the tuning characteristics of this individual neuron. So similar results were also reported in temporal tasks. So this is again the same kind of setup. This is a recording from an individual neuron while the animal was in a passive state, and then the animal engaged in a gap detection task. Notably, it had to react to the presence of a gap in a tone, a noise. And so because this is a temporal task where it has to detect the presence of a silence in the middle of a noise burst, you note these changes to the temporal response peak of this particular neuron. This is another task, temporal task, where the animal had to pay attention to a temporal pattern. In this case, it was a click discrimination, sort of a fast versus a slow click rate. And so again, you see that if you start with a passive receptive field with a certain tuning characteristic, that tuning can actually change in time to get faster or slower depending on the attentional task that the animal is trying to perform. So we also note from these same studies that once the animal is done with the task, more often than not, the neuron goes back to its sort of initial passive state, as if that it starts from a sort of an initial condition. It is able to adapt to the specific behavioral task that the animal is trying to pay attention to, and then it goes back to its intrinsic state. So together, these results indicate that individual neurons in this vast web of millions of cortical neurons can change their tuning properties depending on the attentional goal of the organism at that moment in time. And so a similar picture also emerges in human listeners as well. So this time through coarser recording techniques, we're not recording individual neurons in human listeners, but we can record sort of over populations of neurons. We can record cortical activity using magnetoencephalography, MEG, or electroencephalography, EEG. So in a first study using MEG, we note that attention does enhance the representation of a target sound at the population level. And so in this particular study, we asked human listeners to track a pure note that is embedded in a background of multiple other notes. So this is an example of that stimulus. There is a repeated note shown here in red, and the subjects were asked to pay attention to this note and flag whenever there is a shift in the frequency of the tone. And in the background, there is a broadband set of pure tones that can spread spectrally. As you can see here, this is a spectrogram, sort of a fairly broad representation across the spectral dimension. And so while it is a simplified sound stimulus relative to the complexity of everyday sounds, using a rhythmic target, this rhythmic red notes, allows us to probe how well does activity in auditory cortex track the rhythm in this sound under different attentional states. So what we did in this particular study is we asked subjects to pay attention to the rhythmic pure note, and we record basically brain activity while the subjects are paying attention to this rhythmic note. And what we're seeing here is the Fourier transform of the cortical activity that is recorded in the brain. And you see in this first panel that there is a pretty obvious and huge peak at 4 Hertz, which is the rhythm at which this pure tone was repeating. So not surprisingly, the brain is getting an input with a strong 4 Hertz component, and it's responding with a strong 4 Hertz output. So when the subjects were paying attention to this rhythmic note, we see this presence of this fairly substantial peak of energy around 4 Hertz. What is pretty notable is that under a different attentional condition, now using the exact same stimuli, the exact same physical 4 Hertz is present, the background tones are present. So now the subjects were asked to pay attention to the background, and ignore these, the rhythmic tone, you see that the response power at 4 Hertz is substantially reduced. So now the subjects are not paying attention to this physical 4 Hertz that is present. You still see a small peak, but nowhere near as strong as it was when the subjects were paying attention to the 4 Hertz rhythm. Sort of in another study, this time using EEG, again, to sort of characterize the enhancement of the representation of a target by attention, we again had the subject track a repeating pure note, but this time instead of using these pure tones as a sort of noise background, we used natural scenes as background. And so in this study, again, the subjects were asked to track a repeating pure tone. This time it was at the rhythm of 2.6 Hertz. But the background, as I said, was a natural scene, and these were scenes taken from YouTube, included sounds of children playing in the park, a car race, a concert hall, and many others. So the subject had a clear task. This is, again, a representation of the acoustic signal, and this is a spectrogram, and the subjects had a task to pay attention to this rhythmic pure tone. They were sort of embedded in this rhythmic pure tone were some of the tones that were amplitude modulated, and the subjects had to detect the presence of these specific target modulated tones. And the background was these everyday scenes that the subjects were specifically instructed to ignore and not to pay attention to. And so what we note here again is this is the Fourier transform of the neural response recorded using EEG this time, is that the rhythm at 2.6 Hertz elicited a strong response once the subjects were, when we analyzed the response to these stimuli while the subjects are paying attention to this rhythmic pure tone. But what we also note in this case is if we focus on these specific targets, these modulated tones, we see that the response to the 2.6 Hertz enhances, and in a statistically significant way, during these sort of detected targets. So what is interesting here is that the brain response at this 2.6 Hertz rhythm is getting more enhanced when these targets are present, and that this change is happening dynamically such that the response to 2.6 Hertz is changing over the duration of a stimulus. So as we listen to the stimulus, you get a certain response, and then it sort of shoots up, and then it goes back to this initial state, and then it shoots up again for a given stimulus. So these results basically show us that the brain changes how it encodes the information in the incoming stimulus depending on the relevant information in that stimulus. So these results have been generalized to a number of interesting findings, most notably that attention mediates speaker separation by enhancing representation of a target speaker relative to background speakers. So in a number of studies now, brain responses were recorded from subjects. So this is a typical paradigm that has been used in a number of studies. So subjects are given 2 concurrent speakers, one in red, one in green, as you can see here. And you can record the brain response using a variety of techniques. This is an example in this figure showing EEG. And so using a decoding technique, we can basically reconstruct the envelope of the stimulus that best sort of maps to these brain responses. And what is notable about these findings is that when subjects pay attention to one speaker, let's say the red speaker, and ignore the green speaker, that the reconstructed envelope matches almost faithfully the red speaker as if the green speaker is no longer there. So this is an example from such findings. So what you see here is that in black is the reconstructed envelope from the brain response, in this case using MEG, and in gray is the actual envelope of the stimulus itself, almost indicating that the brain is responding solely to the attended speaker as if the other speaker is not there. So these results have profound implications in the way we understand what information is encoded by the brain and how it balances the external signal, in this case 2 speakers, coming in as an input, and the attentional goal of the listener, which in this case to pay attention to only one of them. So if we go back then to our overview of auditory processing as a series of transformations through these mapping functions parameterized by this these parameters phi, we can interpret the role of attention as a change in this mapping function to probably a new set of parameters phi tilde, with the ultimate goal to facilitate distinction of target sounds, so the sounds that we're interested in, and to enable them to stand out relative to the background that we are less interested in or trying to ignore. So if we imagine an array of these cortical neurons to represent a layer of these mapping parameters phi, what we did is we performed a study to gain a better insight into how changing these parameters, how changing the tuning characteristics of these neurons would trickle down to an enhanced system performance. And so we specifically tested the hypothesis that introducing this attentional feedback to retune these filter parameters would result in a new mapping, this function, phi tilde, that would give us an enhanced representation of the target relative to the background. So we started if we start with an initial mapping function phi, we explored how we can introduce a new mapping function phi tilde by adapting the array of neural firings or neural tuning functions to maximize discriminability between a target and background. So we defined an objective function, in this case, to maximize D prime, sort of a standard statistic used in signal detection theory. And so to achieve this retuning, we defined a parametric cortical model. So instead of using any set of cortical filter tunings, we wanted to be able to control individual dimensions of these filters. So what we did for this specific study is we modeled an array of cortical neurons with an array of Gabor filters, which is a fairly well-established approximation that is commonly used to provide a tiling of spectrotemporal space. So these are Gabor filters that are modulated over time and frequency. And one of the benefits of working with the parametric model is that we can adapt sort of individual components or all parameters of the filter. We can adapt the gain of the filter, we can adapt the modulation tuning in time and frequency, as well as the orientation of these filters. And so we tested this retuning model on a task of speech detection in presence of background noises. And so this is a fairly well-established task. So what we note is that the retuning model does result in notable improvements in speech and noise detection. So this is an example of such results. I'm showing you here sort of false positives against misdetections. And so obviously lower is better. This is applied to one particular database, that the DARPA RAS database that includes a fair amount of nonlinear distortions. And these different lines here are different models. So the black line is this cortical model before adaptation, the original model. The red model is one where the filters have been retuned through this attentional feedback. And these other lines are other models from the literature that have been presented in the case of this speech and noise task. So these are examples of sort of the same speech and noise detection, but with different noise databases. And across the board, what you note is that the adapting or allowing the filters to retune themselves, and this is, by the way, an adaptation that is done with unseen noise data. So it's not like there is a learning of the noise patterns, but allowing the filters to retune themselves does result in improved detection of speech relative to noise. But overall, what we also note when we look at sort of beyond the improvements of performance on this data set of speech and noise, we do observe that the likelihood functions of speech and background noise look different before and after the attentional retuning. And more specifically, we see that with attention, there is a tightening of the likelihood functions of the target speech relative to the noise. And so by achieving this tightening and sort of reducing of the standard deviation across these two classes, what the system as a whole is doing is able to achieve an enhancement of the signal to noise ratio and ultimately improve detection and discriminability. So this sort of leads me to a first conclusion, which is to highlight that attention modulates the information represented in the auditory cortex by retuning the mapping function. And this eventually or sort of ultimately leads to improved discriminability of target sounds against backgrounds. Now, a second form of manifestation of attention in the auditory system is in the fusion of auditory objects. So if we again think about this hierarchical approximation of the auditory processing, what we notice that patterns of activation, sort of these embedding variables across a whole population, seem to also undergo adaptive cooperation that fuses together channels that are temporally coherent. So you can think of this as a biological form of Hebbian interactions. And so specifically, what this observation says is that if you look across the population, channels that tend to be co-activated seem to sort of enhance each other in a Hebbian kind of interaction, while channels that are out of phase with each other tend to suppress each other. And so what this results in is sort of this fusion kind of outcome, in that the channels that are co-activated tend to belong to a similar object, so that helps that object stand out relative to other activity that tends to be and correlated with it. And so a way to interpret this changes is that now the embeddings themselves, these latent variables, are being adapted through this attentional feedback, and attention does facilitate this fusion process, which ultimately results in facilitating foreground and background segregation. So in a very interesting study by Liu et al., the neural responses of individual neurons, again this time in animals paying attention to a stimulus, were recorded. And in this case, they recorded activity from a neuron where the stimulus contained either two frequency channels. So you see here, this is the stimulus sort of time and frequency. And so in one case, the stimulus contained two frequency channels, A and B, that were in phase with each other. And in this other case, the A and B activity were out of phase with each other. And so what we note here, if we focus on this bottom panel, is that when the animal was paying attention to these sounds, when the channels were in sync with each other, you see a broadening of the response, while when the channels were out of phase or alternating, you see sort of a tighter response. And so this figure shows us the difference between the synchronous and the alternating case, where you see this sort of highlighting this broadening that was noted here. If you do the exact same experiment in a passive animal, which is not engaged in attention, you see no difference between the two. And so we wanted to explore this idea again in a theoretical model where we can manipulate the activity across a group of channels this time. So we're not looking at individual filters, but we're looking at a population of filters based on their temporal coherence or synchrony. So what we did first is we extended our framework to a more sort of expanded DNN cortical architecture, because it allows us to expand the effect of feedback across multiple subnetworks. So what we did is we took our basic architecture, and in this time we trained a distributed network of cortical processing layers. So each network here was trained, each sort of sublevel was trained in an unsupervised fashion using restricted Boltzmann machines. And the different sublayers were basically constrained with different resolution constraints. And so that effectively gives us a variety of mapping functions phi for different levels I across this architecture, and ultimately results in an extended STRF space across this sort of distributed system. And so in this system now, we introduce this attentional feedback, but this time we're focusing on attentional feedback that looks across the population of channels. And what we do here is we are assuming that this sort of attention from a target of interest acts as a sort of selection anchor to alter these latent variables Z to some new variables Z tilde, whereby channels that are coherent with the expected activity of the target are going to be enhanced, while channels that are not coherent are going to be suppressed. And so we tested this idea of facilitating fusion of auditory objects in a task sort of to attend to target sound classes in the presence of other distractors. We use this urban sounds data set for which there is an existing convolutional neural network baseline for detection of different events in this database. And so, as I said, our goal was to introduce this attentional feedback, but this time, instead of retuning the individual filters, we're looking at the activity across the channels. And so if we're paying attention to car horns, we are looking at the activity across these different levels and manipulating this activity in a way such that channels that are coherent with our attended target will be enhanced, and the ones that are incoherent with it will be suppressed. So what we note from this manipulation is that there is a robust detection of urban objects in noise using this attention-guided fusion. So the results I'm going to be showing you here is from this analysis in this study. So on the left here is the CNN, sort of a convolutional neural network baseline, and in red here on the right is the attention-guided cortical mapping, and on the y-axis here is the F-score. So the results, when we look what we call clean, basically using the database without any additional background noises, we see, a fairly comparable performance between this sort of expanded cortical architecture and a convolutional neural network architecture. But where the benefits of this attention-guided fusion really manifest themselves is in presence of interferers. So when there is other objects or events that are present in the background, sort of at different levels of SNR, at 10 dB, 5 dB, and 0 dB, you note that the attention-guided system results in a much more robust detection of the object of interest against the interferers or at different levels of noise relative to a sort of convolutional neural network architecture. So this leads me to my second point, or my second conclusion, which is that attention also modulates the readout of cortical embeddings to facilitate grouping of relevant channels, which ultimately, again, facilitates robust representation of target sounds. So the next natural question, obviously, is what is the complementary role of these two forms of attention? So we performed an additional study to look at attention-induced retuning and object fusion to note how complementary they are in facilitating the robust representation of auditory objects. And the study, sort of in a nutshell, is showing us that there is a synergistic relationship, sort of a complementary role of these two forms of attention. So the study in question was, again, looking at this attention-induced both retuning and object fusion. So in this case, we focus on a task of music separation. This is basically a task where we take in as input a music signal that contains vocals and accompaniments. And we have the goal of focusing on a particular target, let's say the vocals. One of the challenges of this task is because these are music recordings, that the target, let's say the vocals, are going to be highly correlated with the background, which sort of sets a different bar in terms of the achievements we're hoping to get from this attentional feedback. And so in this case, the model is trained end-to-end. It takes in as input a spectrogram of the mixture and gives as output the spectrogram of the target of interest, but it is a fairly shallow model compared to the state-of-the-art systems. It assumes no knowledge of any musical architecture or structure in the data, and it's really just the focus is really here is to leverage the knowledge about these targets in these two forms of attention. One, to retune the filters themselves, to alter the outputs that comes out from each sublevel, and then two, to then take in this output and group together channels that are temporally coherent with the attentional target. So we performed the tests of this architecture using sort of the model was trained on a database of Western music. Then it was fine-tuned to attend to specific targets from a completely different data set, a Chinese karaoke data set. There's other results in the original paper, but here I'm reporting on this sort of specific fine-tuned attention to this other database. And so the results that I'm showing here are, so this is a table that shows the signal to distortion ratio. So obviously higher is better in terms of improved detection of individual components or elements in the music. And so here we're looking at a baseline system that is a fairly well-established system in music separation, and we see its ability to detect sort of vocals, bass, drums, and other sounds in the mixture. And here in green, I'm showing the signal to distortion ratio results that we achieve with the attention retuning alone, where the individual filters are being retuned, with the attention fusion, where the population or groups of channels are being fused together based on their coherence, and using the two, both retuning and the fusion together. And what we note is that there is a pretty strong contribution from both these forms of attention in allowing us to improve fairly notably the ability to extract the vocals, the bass, and the drum from these mixtures through the contribution of these two forms of attention in this case. So this gets me to my next sort of interim conclusion, which is that attentional feedback seems to be operating as a form of bottleneck that reshapes the representation of information propagating through the system. I do want to note here that the use of the term attention is very different than how it has been commonly used as of late in the deep learning literature, which tends to think of attention as a kind of soft search operation, while the form of attention we're talking about here is really about reshaping the actual characteristics of what information sort of trickles through the system. So to regroup, I have been emphasizing that how attention is really operating as this pervasive feedback system that is present throughout the auditory pathway. However, something that I need to note here is that attention can be controlled in many ways. So, and it is really not a monolithic process. So the type of attention I've been describing so far is what is referred to as endogenous or task-driven attention, meaning that you choose to attend to, hopefully, my talk relative to what else is going on around you, or the animal is trained to pay attention to a tone or a click. So this is sort of a task-driven, what we call top-down attention, meaning that based on a specific task, we choose which sound events or targets to pay attention to. Now, our attention can actually also be grabbed by sounds in the environment itself in what is referred to as exogenous or stimulus-driven attention, or also referred to as bottom-up attention, because it may be outside of our internal control. So there is quite a big deal of sort of interaction between this bottom-up attention and top-down attention, and the presence of this bottom-up attention does complicate the story I've been telling you so far. So if you imagine you're having a conversation and you're trying to pay attention to the person you're talking to, if there were to be a sort of a loudspeaker on the side calling on everybody's attention, you will inadvertently be aware of it and pay attention to it, regardless of what conversation you are immersed in. And similarly, you know, if you imagine you were listening to a melody, sort of a violin melody, and all of a sudden a piano note were to show up, that will, you know, stand out from the background and attract your attention, regardless of your sort of will or task-driven focus on the violin notes that you were paying attention to. So there is a great deal of interaction between bottom-up and top-down attention, and many aspects of that is not well understood. So in some recent studies, we are finding out that these interactions, you know, sort of, as I said, complicate the story in the sense of understanding how top-down attention operates in the system. So if we go back to the simplified diagram of this hierarchical auditory processing, I have talked about the mapping of observations X into this latent variable Z, but there is in fact evidence that the brain not only maps these embedding representations Z, but also a version of the decoder function P of X given Z. So it's not just about the mapping of these variables given the input, but there is also a great deal of representation of the input given these variables. And this is in many ways similar to what you would do for an autoencoder system, for example, by controlling both the encoder and the decoder function. So the idea which is at the core of this theory, referred to as the predictive coding theory, in the brain, it posits that access to these predictions, or a probability of X given Z, allows the brain to build expectations about what it expects to in the world around it, and that violations of these expectations, if you imagine estimating sort of a distance metric or a comparison between the observed inputs and the predicted inputs. And so violations of these expectations are in fact correlated with events in the input that would attract our attention. So the example I just gave you right now of these sort of violin melodies, if you imagine you've been listening to this violin melody and your representation of this embedding space is very much built around the statistics of these violins, which inform what you expect to see next, that will certainly be violated if a piano were to show up, which carries a completely different set of characteristics as opposed to what the brain was expected to see in this probability of X given Z. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about how this interaction actually takes place. So if we go back to the study that I mentioned earlier in my talk, where subjects were asked to pay attention or track a pure tone in the presence of natural backgrounds. So just to remind you, this is this study that I mentioned earlier, where we asked subjects to pay attention to this rhythmic pure tone. They were asked to detect the presence of modulations, amplitude modulations that were embedded in this rhythmic pure tone. And in the background, we had these sort of everyday backgrounds that were present, but the subjects were asked to completely ignore these backgrounds. They had no relevance to the task at hand. But since these are everyday backgrounds, they actually carry quite a deal of salient events. So these are backgrounds, as I said, that include car races, a symphony hall, children playing. And so occasionally you would get patterns of activity or sort of sound events in these backgrounds that would stand out as salient and sort of inadvertently distract our listeners, whose task was to pay attention to this rhythmic tone and detect these green bursts. So if we now look at the neural activity that we are able to record from these subjects while they're performing this task, so again, just to emphasize, they're paying attention to these red sort of rhythmic pure notes, and they are supposed to be ignoring this background. So if we look at the neural activity, these are brain recordings from different channels across the brain. So when we look at the Fourier transform, so these are similar figures to those I showed you earlier, we see that the response to this 2.6 Hertz, this rhythmic pattern, is at a certain level, and then when the subjects detect the presence of these green targets, this the spectral energy at 2.6 Hertz increases. But what we also note is that when these salient events are present in the background, all of a sudden this rhythmic representation of the rhythm is substantially suppressed. So during the same trial, not only does the activity change depending on whether these targets are present or not, but it also changes if the subject's distraction are distracted away from this task that they're supposed to be paying attention to by the physical nature of presence of these salient notes. So when we look at the statistics across these different conditions, so what we're looking at here is the activity, sort of the change in this black activity throughout the these rhythmic notes, and we notice that over the duration of the stimulus, sort of away from these special moments, the stimulus is fairly stable, sort of the energy of the response is fairly stable, while during or near where these modulated targets are present, we see an enhancement of the phase lock-in or the neural response to these targets. And conversely, when the subjects are distracted or their attentional, their focus or the attentional feedback is taken away or sort of oriented towards the salient background, we see a suppression of the neural representation of this physical input at 2.6 Hertz. The degree of distraction or this reduction in the spectral energy is modulated by the degree of salience. So specifically when we look at high salience sort of background events, we see a bigger suppression, while mid-salience background events give us sort of a lower suppression, while low salience events give us a non-significant amount of suppression. So it seems that even though the subjects are paying attention to this fairly simple, rhythmic tone, they do occasionally lose their ability to stay focused and get distracted. And so the brain's representation of this attended rhythm does get reduced. So conversely to that is if we look at what happens to the encoding of these background events. So if you recall, I mentioned that we can decode the stimulus that would have driven the best response from a neural response, and that's something that I have mentioned that has been done with a great deal of success, looking at the separations of if we attend to one speaker versus a second speaker, we can reconstruct the envelope that best sort of maps to the neural response to that input. And so we can do the same thing here using these stimuli, and we see that our ability to decode after a salient event is much more enhanced relative to before a salient event, again suggesting that the subjects not only are distracted away from these targets, but are also representing these salient events with much more prominence. What makes sort of these results even more interesting is that we note that both top-down and bottom-up attention seem to activate a common brain network, even though it is actually offset in time. So in this particular analysis, what we looked at is we looked at the brain activity, so basically which brain voxels were active near these target tones and which brain voxels were active near these salient events. And we looked at this activity over time, and we performed a form of cross-correlation analysis basically to tell us whether there are moments in time where the activity near these salient events was similar to the pattern of activity near these target tones. And so what we get is this kind of cross-correlation matrix that correlates the brain voxels, sort of the different regions in the brain response in response to these salient events, versus on the y-axis, the brain activity in response to these top-down targets. And what we see is we see this sort of off-diagonal response indicating that there is a statistical significant moment where both brain networks are sort of, both types of stimuli are activating the same brain network, but it is offset in that the bottom-up attention network stimulus engages this network earlier than the top-down attentional network. And so this network specifically engages frontal and parietal regions in the brain. The fact that both these forms of attention are activating a common brain network suggests that for us to get a better understanding of this sort of interaction between bottom-up and top-down attention, having the same network engaged will have to manage resources between these two. So this push-pull between bottom-up attention and top-down attention in terms of computational resources will have to be managed, or is being managed, by the brain. And so if we want to map that into a theoretical model, we have to think carefully about how to balance what we're trying to achieve in terms of a task against the distractions that may happen from some sounds of interest coming in from the stimulus. So with that, I'm going to sort of conclude with these final remarks in that hopefully I have shown you through this talk that auditory attention is really a sweeping mechanism, or in fact sets of mechanisms that engages cognitive control in guided sensory processing in the auditory system, and that interpretation of attention as control of neural resources is certainly a valid interpretation, but one has to take it with caution, because you want to not only think of it as a sort of selection set of filters, but it also, the attentional feedback has implications in terms of reshaping the actual representation itself of the information that comes in through the system. And so obviously this attentional feedback seems to implicate the entire processing pipeline to balance the sound guided salience with the target guided selection. And so it is, I think, important to think about the implication of this sort of push-pull interaction beyond just specific tasks. So when we try to achieve an event detection task, while we are certainly focused on that task, and that guides a lot of how we would imagine the processing pipeline would work, there is quite a great deal of interaction that has to do with the acoustics of the stimulus that needs to be balanced. And there's a lot of open questions for us as a community to explore in terms of the theoretical and neural implications of this interaction. So with that, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the funding agencies that supported a range of this work: the National Science Foundation, the NIH, the Office of Naval Research, and NASA. And I wanted to thank you for your attention.